In 1961, Stanley Milgram placed a small classified ad in a New Haven newspaper. He was looking for volunteers for a paid study on memory and learning at Yale University. The pay was $4.50. Hundreds of people answered: teachers, engineers, postal workers, salespeople, ordinary people with ordinary lives. When each volunteer arrived at the lab, they met a second person they believed was another participant. They drew slips of paper to assign roles. One would be the teacher, one the learner. The draw was rigged. The real volunteer always became the teacher. The other person was an actor. The actor, playing the learner, was taken to an adjoining room, strapped into a chair, and fitted with electrodes on his wrist. The teacher sat in front of a shock generator, a gray metal box with 30 switches arranged in a row across the front. The first switch was labeled 15 volts. The last was labeled 450 volts. Below the highest switches, a label read, "Danger, severe shock." The teacher's job was to read word pairs through an intercom and administer a shock for every wrong answer, increasing the voltage by 15 volts each time. The learner kept getting answers wrong. At 75 volts, he grunted. At 120, he complained the shocks were becoming painful. At 150, he demanded to be released from the experiment entirely. At 270, he screamed. At 300 volts, he pounded on the wall and stopped responding. Each time the teacher hesitated or tried to stop, the experimenter, a calm man in a gray lab coat, would say one of four things. "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue." Before the study ran, Milgram asked a panel of psychiatrists to predict how many participants would reach the maximum voltage. Their answer? Less than 1%. They believed only someone with a serious personality disorder would continue past the point where a person was screaming to be released. They were wrong by 64 percentage points. 65% of participants administered the maximum 450-volt shock. Not 1%, not 5%. 65, and they were not monsters. In every measurable psychological dimension, they were indistinguishable from the people who stopped. They were you. When most people hear this, the reaction is almost immediate. I would have stopped. Not me. I would have walked out. This is precisely what the psychiatrists believed, and Milgram's research is, in part, a study of exactly why that prediction fails. The 65% were not more aggressive than the 35%, not more anxious, not more deferential, on any pre-experiment psychological measure. The difference between the person who stopped and the person who didn't was not in the person. It was in the structure of the situation they were placed inside. Here is the first part of the explanation. No one in the experiment was ever asked to go from 0 to 450 volts. The first step was 15. 15 volts is approximately the sensation of touching a doorknob after shuffling across a carpet. Almost nothing. From 15, the next step is 30, then 45, then 60. At each individual step, at the exact moment it is being taken, the increment is 15 volts and 15 volts only. Psychologists call this incremental commitment. Once a person has agreed to a small request, the psychological cost of refusing a slightly larger one feels disproportionately high. By the time a teacher reached genuinely dangerous voltages, they had already made 20 or 30 separate decisions to continue. Stopping at 300 volts would require, psychologically, invalidating every one of those prior decisions. The brain does not write off accumulated choices easily. What looked from the outside like cruelty was, from the inside, an inability to find the precise moment where the line had been crossed. There was no moment. There were only steps. But that is only the first part of the answer. Milgram ran the experiment more than 20 times, changing one variable at a time. When the experimenter gave instructions by telephone instead of being present in the room, compliance dropped from 65% to 20%. When the teacher had to physically hold the learner's hand onto a shock plate, compliance dropped further. When the experiment moved from the prestigious Yale campus to a nondescript commercial office building in Bridgeport, compliance fell to 47%, still extraordinarily high, but measurably lower. And when two actors posing as fellow teachers refused to continue and walked out, compliance collapsed to 10%. 10%. The same participants, the same switches, the same screaming from the next room. The only thing that changed was two people had refused first. What Milgram called this was the agentic state. Under specific social conditions, human beings shift from operating as autonomous moral agents to operating as executing components of a larger system. They are still making choices, but they have transferred the moral weight of those choices upward, to the authority, to the institution, to the structure they are embedded in. Milgram was explicit that this is not a pathology. Civilization requires it. Every large-scale cooperative structure humans have ever built, hospitals, militaries, corporations, governments, depends on individuals executing decisions made by others without re-evaluating every instruction from scratch. The cognitive mechanism that makes large-scale human cooperation possible is the same one that kept 65% of participants in that chair past the point where they should have gotten up. It is not a defect. It is a feature of human social cognition that under the wrong conditions produces catastrophic results. Here is the part almost nobody talks about. Milgram's study was not replicated once. It was replicated in Germany, Australia, Italy, and Jordan, and in populations varying widely in age, class, and education. The results varied by country and context, but nowhere did compliance fall to what the psychiatrists had predicted, and in Germany, the rate reached 85%. In 2010, French television broadcast a documentary in which 80 participants, believing they were contestants on a game show, were instructed by a host to administer electric shocks to a screaming man in a studio chair. There was no experimenter in a lab coat. There was a live studio audience. 81% of the contestants continued to the maximum voltage. The audience did not stop them. In some cases, the applause appeared to make it easier. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University randomly assigned college students to the roles of guards and prisoners in a simulated jail built in the basement of the psychology building. The study was designed to run 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. The guards had not been screened for cruelty. They had been randomly assigned to a uniform and a role. The situation did the rest. And this mechanism is not contained inside psychology labs or television studios. On January 27, 1986, engineers at Morton Thiokol spent the hours before the Challenger launch arguing that the O-rings sealing the solid rocket boosters would fail in the cold temperatures forecast for the next morning. They had data. They had charts. They had decades of combined engineering expertise telling them to ground the flight. The NASA managers they reported to overruled them. Sociologist Diane Vaughan spent nearly a decade reviewing every document, memo, and interview from that night. Her finding was not that the managers had ignored the warnings. It was that they had spent years inside an organization where minor deviations from safety standards had been followed, repeatedly, by successful launches. Each successful launch made the next acceptable deviation slightly easier to absorb. The incremental logic that moved a volunteer from 15 volts to 450 had moved an institution, year by year, from acceptable risk to catastrophe. 7 people died, not because anyone chose to harm them, because no one inside the system could locate the accumulated moment where their obligation had required refusal. Milgram spent years after his initial findings trying to understand what would break the pattern. His clearest result was also his simplest. The single most reliable predictor of refusal was not the participant's personality. It was whether someone else in the room had already refused, before the escalation had gone too far. When 2 Confederates walked out early, visibly, before the voltages reached critical levels, compliance fell from 65% to 10%. Not because those Confederates gave participants new information. The teachers already knew the shocks were harmful. What the dissenters provided was something different. Proof that the role of person who says no existed inside this situation. That refusal was structurally possible. In every institution, in every group, in every collective situation where the authority is calm and the steps are small and the objectors are silent, The person who speaks first is doing something categorically different from everyone who speaks afterward. They are not being brave in the way we usually mean brave. They are not overcoming a fear. They are naming an exit that everyone else in the room has, without any discussion, agreed to pretend is not there. 65% of the people who sat in that room in New Haven in 1961 administered the maximum shock. They went home that evening. They made dinner. They called their families. They were not extraordinary. They were not broken. Neither are the people who will sit in equivalent chairs tomorrow, in a different room, with different switches, inside a different kind of institution. The only question Milgram's research leaves permanently open is the one it was never designed to answer. In whatever room you are already in, have you found the exit, and have you told anyone where it is?